Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I've got something a little different for you. We all love a good ghost story or creepy encounter, right? Well, in this video, we're diving into a collection of spine-chilling experiences that I, or people close to me, have lived through. From haunted houses and eerie noises to unsettling encounters in the middle of nowhere, these stories will make you question what's real and what might just be, a little beyond our understanding. So, grab a blanket, maybe turn on a light, and settle in for some true stories that will leave you thinking twice about what could be lurking in the dark. Let's get into it, but be warned, you might not be able to sleep after this one. I don't remember all the details, but I was really young, maybe around 7 years old, when we lived in that old house. My room was on its own floor, separate from the rest of the house. It wasn't even meant to be a bedroom. It was more like an add-on to the attic, almost like a little closet room. The people who lived there before us had used it as a playroom for their daughters. There was this huge closet in my room that led up to the attic. The closet was raised, so you had to climb a set of wooden stairs just to get into it. It had a big sliding door, and inside, it was packed with old toys and random stuff I'd probably forgotten about. But as a little kid, I was always spooked by how isolated my room felt. I hated being so far away from everyone else and that closet. It made everything worse. One night, after watching a scary movie with my family, I was lying in bed feeling uneasy when I suddenly heard something, a toy falling over, maybe. I froze for a second, then immediately jumped out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room. I was terrified, and they could see it. They told me there was nothing in the closet, but they could tell I was really shaken up, so they let me sleep in their room that night. The next evening, I had almost forgotten about the night before, until it happened again. This time, I heard the unmistakable sound of Legos spilling all over the floor in that closet. My heart raced. I bolted out of my room and went straight to my parents again. I told them what I'd heard, and by then, my dad was starting to get a little frustrated. He wasn't used to my fear, and I could tell he didn't want to keep giving in. But seeing how terrified I was, he reluctantly agreed to let me sleep in their room again. The next day, my mom and I decided to check the closet again. And sure enough, there they were, Legos, scattered all over the floor, spilled out of the container. I thought this was proof that someone had been in my closet, but my mom reassured me that it was just an accident, that the container must have tipped over on its own. That night, my dad locked his bedroom door. He said he was tired of my nonsense. I couldn't sleep, though. I lay there, absolutely still, my mind racing. I kept waiting for something, anything, to happen. My imagination ran wild, and I just knew I was going to hear something from that closet again. It must have been about an hour before it happened. The silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of the closet door being shoved open with force. The moonlight coming through my window lit up the figure standing by the closet. I was frozen with fear, but then, the terror hit. I let out the loudest, most piercing scream you can imagine, pure, unfiltered panic flooding my body. The figure leapt down from the closet and sprinted out of my room, charging through the front door of the house. My mom came rushing upstairs in shock, and my dad ran downstairs, trying to catch whoever it was. But by the time he got downstairs, there was no sign of anyone. The police were called, but they never found the person who had been in the house that night. Years later, in 8th grade, I went on a school trip called the Louisiana Tour, where we visited significant landmarks in southern Louisiana. One of the stops was Myrtle's Plantation, which is known for being one of the most haunted places in the country. There are all sorts of ghost stories tied to the place, and during one of the tours, we were in a room with a big group of people. I can't remember what the tour guide was talking about, but as I stood there, I started hearing something strange. It sounded like someone was hitting a piano key. At first, I brushed it off, but after I heard it a few times, I started looking around the room, trying to find where the sound was coming from. There was no piano in sight, but I could still hear it. I turned to my friends and asked if they heard it, but they said no. I was starting to feel like I was going crazy. Then, when I heard the sound again, I pointed it out to them. There it is. They just looked at me like I was imagining things. As I stood there, still listening, everyone else was focused on the tour guide. Except for one woman. She caught my eye, then pointed at me and then at her ear, looking at me with a questioning expression. I realized she was asking if I heard the sound too. I nodded, and she seemed relieved. Just then, the tour guide started telling a story about a soldier who had died at the plantation, a soldier who used to play the piano. He said that many guests had reported hearing him play late at night. Honestly, I didn't know what to make of it. Even now, I'm not sure what to think. As we were leaving the room, I spoke to the woman who had caught my eye. She said she'd heard the same thing I did, the piano key sounds. But her husband and son hadn't heard anything. We both just stood there, trying to figure out what had happened. It was around Halloween when my friends and I were sitting around telling ghost stories. One of my friends, a bit hesitantly, said she was going to share a story about her parents' first date. She didn't really like telling it because it was actually true, but we all pushed her to go ahead, so she did. Her parents had a pretty nice, if awkward, first date. Toward the end of the night, when they would have said goodnight, her dad, who at the time was just a guy she was getting to know, suggested they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He was familiar with the area since he did a lot of rock climbing there, so he knew the trail well. So, the two of them drove to the mouth of the canyon, parked, and set off on a hike, with nothing but the light from the stars to guide them, since it was a new moon that night. At some point, as they hiked along, her dad started to feel really uneasy. The path ahead, which went under some trees, was starting to get really dark. And though it felt wrong, he shrugged it off and decided to keep going. But the feeling kept growing stronger, like something wasn't right. Then, as they moved deeper into the trees, his foot brushed against something soft in the middle of the trail. He couldn't see what it was, but the feeling of dread hit him full force. He and my friend's mom both agreed it was time to leave, something just wasn't right. So, they turned around and hightailed it out of there. Years later, after they were married, they were watching an interview with Ted Bundy. The interviewer asked him to describe the time he felt closest to being caught. Bundy replied that it was a night he had lured a girl into Provo Canyon, killed her, and was in the process of hiding the body when he heard people coming up the trail. He said he hid just in time, only to watch a man walk right into the body, and, for some reason, just turn around and walk away. It turns out, that man was my friend's dad. This next part happened to me in college. My school library is open late, until 2 a.m., which is great for procrastinators like me who put off essays until the last minute. It's a small building, and most of the books are in the basement, in an area called the Stacks. To give you a quick idea of the layout, there's a big set of stairs that leads down to the stacks, a vending machine room, and a long hallway with 4 entrances into the stacks. One night, around 11 p.m., I was there working on a research-heavy essay. I'd been in the stacks for about 2 hours, and by then, everyone else had left except for a guy a few desks down from me. I was starting to get pretty stressed. My essay was due the next morning at 8 a.m., and I hadn't even started on the conclusion yet. So, when I started hearing the sound of someone flipping through book pages really fast, making that loud, whipping noise, I was already on edge. I figured it'd stop after a minute, but it didn't. It just kept going. After about 5 minutes of that noise, I was so annoyed that I got up and started to walk over to tell them to cut it out. But just as I started walking, the noise stopped. I sat back down, thinking maybe it was just a fluke, but after 10 minutes of silence, it started up again. This time, it was louder, like someone had grabbed a big book and started flipping through it. By then, the guy a few desks down from me was getting frustrated, too. He stood up and started walking around the shelves, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. I got up and started looking, too. The noise was so loud by now that it was pretty obvious where it was coming from. We walked toward it, with him on one side of the shelves and me on the other. We got to the end of the row of bookshelves, and found nothing. We hadn't seen anyone come in, and we were on the side of the room closest to the entrances, so there was no way anyone could have snuck in without us noticing. The noise stopped again. We just stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Slowly, we walked back to our seats, trying to brush it off. I told myself it was probably just a fan or something in another room. We sat down, but before I could even open my laptop again, the flipping pages noise started up right next to the guy's chair. He immediately shoved his stuff into his bag, looked at me, and said, "I'm out of here," before bolting for the door. I wasn't far behind him. I grabbed my stuff and left the stacks in about 5 seconds. I've never gone back to the stacks at night, even if there are other people there. That place still gives me the creeps. This happened a few years ago when I still had my fishing boat. It was one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had, and it's something I'll never forget. My wife and I had set out from the East Coast for a 2-day fishing trip in the North Atlantic. The first day and night were pretty normal. We had a decent catch, played cards, and listened to music. It was just the two of us out there, enjoying the quiet. But things took a strange turn the following night. After a slow day on the water, we were playing cards again inside the cabin, this time without the music. It was just us, the boat rocking gently in the water, and the darkness surrounding us. Then, suddenly, we heard the sound of a boat motor. We rushed outside to see a man piloting a rundown motorboat, no lights on, drifting straight toward us. He stopped directly in front of our bow. The guy was middle-aged, wearing a baseball cap, and had a scruffy beard. I went up to him and asked if he needed help. He just looked at me blankly and asked if we had any spare gasoline. I told him no, sorry, and asked if he was running low on fuel, offering him a ride back to shore. He said he had plenty of gas. That was when the weirdness started to settle in. Why had he asked us for gas, if he didn't need it? The silence between us was thick and uncomfortable, especially with the way he was staring at me. The only light around us was from the small deck light on our boat, and everything else was swallowed by complete darkness. Finally, he broke the silence. He asked if we had a good catch that day. I told him we hadn't caught much, trying to keep the conversation polite, even though everything about this situation was off. I asked him how he was getting around in the dark, but he just chuckled, like I had made a joke. Then, without another word, he turned his little boat around. As he started drifting back into the blackness, he waved and said, "Nice meeting you folks." And that was it. He was gone, swallowed by the night. My wife and I both stood there, uneasy. She told me she was worried he might rob us, but I had an even stronger gut feeling that something was wrong with this guy. Fishermen and sailors cross paths all the time, and while it's always a bit weird meeting strangers out at sea, this man felt different. He showed up at such a late hour, so far from the shore, alone in that tiny boat, acting so strangely. We were both on edge, so I decided to turn off our lights and sail a bit further north, just to make sure the guy couldn't find us again. Call me paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. Later that night, probably around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my wife's blood-curdling scream. My heart dropped as I shot up in bed. I looked across the room, and there, standing at the edge of our bed, was a man. I didn't even think. I lunged out of bed, but by the time I got to the door, he was gone. I heard the familiar sound of the motorboat engine starting up again, then speeding away into the night. We didn't waste any time. We packed up, turned the boat around, and headed straight back to shore. Once we got there, we reported the man to the authorities, but nothing ever came of it. They couldn't find any trace of him. To this day, I still don't know what that guy was after or what he planned to do. But it still gives me nightmares, especially the look on his face and the way he just disappeared into the darkness. This next story happened when I was in high school. My bedroom had a weird layout. Across from my bed, there was a small alcove that stayed completely dark because of the closet blocking the light from outside. It was around the time I was in my 4th year of high school, and I was having trouble sleeping one night. You know that feeling when you're just sure someone's staring at you? Well, that's exactly what I felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept my eyes closed, trying to ignore it, but the sensation of being watched was so strong, it made my skin crawl. Finally, I opened my eyes and, in the darkness of that corner, I saw a darker shape, like an outline of something standing there. It was like a shadow, but wrong. My heart started racing, and I got goosebumps. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I shut my eyes again, but I couldn't shake the sense of evil coming from that corner. Then, I heard it, a soft creak, like someone was putting weight on the floorboards. I opened my eyes again, and the shadow had moved. Now it was in the opposite corner of the room. That's when I completely freaked out. My instincts were screaming at me to get away, but all I could do was throw the blanket and pillow over my head, hoping whatever it was wouldn't get any closer. I didn't imagine it. I know I didn't. And the memory still sends chills down my spine to this day. This next one was the first time my family ever went camping together. I was 18 at the time, and it was my younger brother and sister, twins, who convinced my parents to take us. It was mid-July, and I was actually kind of excited about it. We didn't go to a campsite. Instead, my dad just parked the car on the side of a quiet road, and we hiked about a mile into the woods. We found a small clearing and set up 2 tents, one for me and the twins, and one for my parents. That night, I had the hardest time getting to sleep. The ground was hard, and my sleeping bag felt like it was filled with rocks. My little brother and sister were already asleep, and I was lying there, trying to get comfortable. And then, I heard it, the sound of the zipper on the tent, slowly being pulled down. I froze, wondering if maybe my parents were just checking on me. I looked up and saw a figure poking its head inside the tent. At first, I whispered, "Dad." The figure didn't answer but quickly pulled its head back outside. I called out louder, "Dad." But whoever it was quickly moved away from the tent, leaving it unzipped. I was confused and a little scared at that point, so I crawled out of the tent and went over to my parents' tent. I unzipped it and crawled inside, but my parents were both still sound asleep in their sleeping bags. I shook my dad awake and asked if he had just checked on us. He looked at me, half awake, and said no. When I asked my mom, she groggily told me she hadn't left the tent either. That's when the chills really hit me. Who had poked their head into our tent? I got goosebumps all over when I realized what had just happened. Someone had actually come up to our tent, unzipped it, and peeked inside. A stranger, for all I knew, who knows what kind of psycho would do something like that. I still don't really know if my parents took me seriously when I told them, or maybe I just don't remember their reaction. But I do remember this, I didn't get a minute of sleep that night. My parents were on their honeymoon in Key West. When they arrived at the hotel to check in, they were told the room they booked would be non-smoking. But since my dad smokes, they requested a different room. The hotel staff agreed and they went up to the new room. As they got off the elevator, they were hit with the overwhelming smell of fresh paint in the hallway. Down the hall, they saw a painter with all his supplies laid out, working on the wall. They greeted him casually, but he didn't respond at all, not even a glance in their direction. My parents thought it was a little odd, but they didn't think too much of it. But when they walked into their new room, the smell of paint was even worse, so strong it was almost unbearable. They decided to go back to the front desk and ask to be moved again. When they explained the situation, the attendant was really confused and told them there wasn't a scheduled paint job on that floor. But, to be fair, they agreed to switch rooms anyway. My parents went back to grab their things, and when they returned to the hallway, the painter was gone. All his supplies were packed up, and the smell of paint was completely gone. They were freaked out but shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a weird coincidence. But the next morning, while they were heading to breakfast, they overheard a tour guide talking to a group. The guide mentioned that on the floor my parents were originally assigned, a painter had fallen down the elevator shaft and died many years ago. My parents aren't the type to believe in paranormal stuff, but after that experience, they were both completely rattled. It was one of those things that there's just no explanation for. This next story didn't happen to me, but it's still so creepy I can't get it out of my head. It actually happened to my cousin, Nicky. He was on Skype with his girlfriend, Sam, around 1 o'clock in the morning on a Friday night. Sam was asking him to come over and stay the night, but he didn't want to drive that late. At some point during their conversation, Nicky noticed the closet door behind Sam had opened a little. He pointed it out, and Sam turned around to look at it, but they both just shrugged it off, assuming it was nothing. About a half hour later, the door creaked open even more. Nicky mentioned it again and joked that her little brother must be hiding in there. Sam insisted it wasn't her brother and blamed it on the open window causing a draft. But then, about half an hour later, something stepped out of the closet and walked out of Sam's bedroom. Nicky saw it, but Sam didn't seem to notice. Nicky told her, "Your brother's hiding in your closet," but Sam's next words froze him in his tracks. She told him she was home alone that night. Nicky panicked. He started yelling at the screen, telling Sam to lock her door and call the police. He said he would be over there as fast as he could. Sam was starting to realize the gravity of the situation when she turned and saw the closet door wide open. She ran to the door, screaming, and slammed it shut, locking it. Nicky raced over to her house, calling the police the whole time. When he arrived, the front door was wide open. He ran inside and made his way to Sam's room, knocking on the door, but she wouldn't answer. When the police finally showed up, they had to break down the door. Inside, they found Sam curled up in the corner of the room, in shock. Sam later told the police that she had seen someone standing in the doorway right before she slammed the door shut. Whoever it was, they were face to face with her. I still can't get over how chilling that must have been for her. And finally, this last story is about one of those nights I'll never forget. It was a dark and stormy night, one of those storms that I actually love, with thunder crashing and lightning flashing. I was staying up late watching movies in my room, which I shared with my dad. But that night, my dad wasn't home. He was working the night shift. After watching Forrest Gump for what felt like the 100th time, I decided 2 a.m. was as good a time as any to get some sleep. I love falling asleep to thunderstorms, the sound is so calming. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard something hit my window. It wasn't the sound of rain hitting the glass, it was something harder. In a storm like that, I didn't think much of it, though. I just put my head back down and tried to ignore it. A few seconds later, I heard it again. This time, I could make out the sound of something like a rock hitting the window. My heart started racing. It couldn't be my dad. He would have called if something was wrong. But another rock hit the window, and this time, I was frozen in place. I didn't want to look outside, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I just lay there, staring at the window, listening to the storm raging outside. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I had no idea what was going on, but something about it didn't sit right. Whoever was outside definitely knew I was awake. I just turned off the TV, so the glow from the screen probably gave me away through the window. I figured if I just ignored it, they'd go away. But then, another rock hit the window, this time harder, and then another, faster than before. The rain had started to lighten up, which made the sound even more noticeable. That's when I heard the engine of a truck running down on the street, and then a loud thud against the window. That was it. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I quickly jumped out of bed, thinking I was about to call the police. I ran downstairs toward the phone, but as I passed the front door, something caught my eye through the glass window at the top. It was a face. A person, just standing there, staring in at me. They had this weird, unsettling smile on their face. I froze for a second, panic setting in. Then I sprinted into the kitchen and grabbed the phone. I called the police, my hands shaking. They said an officer was nearby and would be there soon. As I was on the phone, I heard whoever was outside start messing with the doorknob, then they started banging against the door, trying to break it open. I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection, my heart racing, and yelled through the door that the police were coming. I ran back upstairs to my room, not knowing what else to do. The banging stopped after a minute, and the rocks hitting my window finally stopped, too. I didn't dare look outside, but I distinctly heard the sound of the truck driving off. A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable wail of a police siren. Then the doorbell rang. I quickly went down and explained everything to the officer. I described the face I saw as best as I could, but I couldn't give them any details about the truck. If only I'd looked out the window for just a second, maybe I could have gotten something useful. The police couldn't really do much with what I gave them. There wasn't enough to go on to track down whoever had been outside. To this day, I can't help but wonder what they were really after. Whether they were trying to rob me or had something worse in mind, I'll never know. But not looking out that window still haunts me.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Your support means the world to me. Thanks for being here, and we'll catch you in the next video.